Dungeon Blaster, and this is episode 2 of Mnemonic Enhancer, here to offer you this week's piece of system-agnostic cyberpunk tabletop advice. Today's episode is called Twists and Turns. Today we're going to be talking about some of the more common type of missions your PCs might face in a campaign, what elements you might want to add into each type, how to keep them from becoming stale, and what you'll want to have prepped for each. Before we get started, I'll give you a brief overview of the more common types of jobs. The 3 most common types of gigs that I've personally ran or seen ran in Cyberpunk games are heists, exfiltrations, and assassinations. Before that, let's just take a brief aside. Before we start, I'd just like to take a second to talk about how most mission-style cyberpunk scenarios can be broken down into a fairly simple 3-act structure. Generally, the first act will be legwork, likely consisting of a mixture of investigation, reconnaissance, infiltration, and research. Expect hacker and face types to shine a bit extra during this stage. Next up, we have the gig itself, completing whatever goal the team has been paid to handle or taken upon themselves. This will be the time for your troubleshooters, drone jockeys, gun bunnies, and street samurais to really shine. Finally, we have the getaway and the payoff. If your group is an established getaway driver, this will be their time in the spotlight, and possibly the gun bunnies if the getaway wasn't clean. But now that we've got that out of the way, let's take a deeper look at the most common types of gigs and ways to spice each of them up. Heists are perhaps the most iconic type of gig in Cyberpunk. Conveniently, they're also one of the easiest type of gigs to run and prep as a GM. The elements of a heist are simple: a MacGuffin of some sort that's locked away in a hyper-secure location and guarded by a formidable force. So long as these 3 elements are present, you can weave a heist out of almost any plot ideas you may have, and likely find a dramatic method to tie it into your larger narrative. However, if you want to get just a touch more advanced here, a strong getaway scene and a trapped vault can add a lot to this type of scenario in the way of drama. While heist prep may seem daunting at first, it's surprisingly simple. I always like to start by listing any relevant rooms for the mission and establishing how the building in question can be entered and exited. You don't need to draw a map here. A quick list of rooms and notable things that your players might find in them will do. Next, I like to figure out how many patrols the players can expect, how many stationary guards are in the building, and whether I want to include some type of boss encounter. Finally, you'll want to figure out if there's any surprises waiting for your PCs inside the vault. All right, now let's talk about some of the ways to keep heists interesting and keep your players guessing. The key here is the element of surprise. You may find misinformation to be one of your most valuable tools here. Bad rolls during legwork should have interesting consequences beyond simply being caught by guards during prep. Perhaps the team's hacker ascertained the guards' patrol routes but accidentally grabbed the wrong date, or they miss an important notice to that the high-threat security teams will be on the premises for the next week due to a recent threat. Shady contacts can be another excellent form of misinformation. However, when working with misinformation, you should be careful to use it sparingly and only use it when dramatically appropriate. Overusing this tactic is begging your players to lose trust in you. The next tactic I like to employ here is surprise visits from high-ranking personnel, complete with personal security teams a la Undercover Boss. This can create an interesting dynamic, forcing the players to avoid the higher-ups in their security teams while the standing supervisor tries desperately to cater to their surprise visitor and give them a tour of the facility. Another great twist in heist situation is to have them be employed in by a especially mysterious corpo for a strictly non-lethal heist. Unknowingly, the PCs have now been hired for their first job as white hats, hired to test the building's security without killing any employees. Unlike other twists, having this information be open to the PCs from the start doesn't necessarily spoil it, and perhaps may even change the mission's dynamic. Finally, I'd like to talk about perhaps my favorite tactic: rival thieves hitting the same gig at the same time. I particularly enjoy this, if only because of the sheer number of possibilities that can be achieved. In essence, this one is simple. It forces the PCs to work against 2 separate parties and gives them 2 separate goals. On the surface, the goal remains the same: get the MacGuffin. However, a new secondary goal has been subtly introduced: deal with the other team. Remember that while guards will eat whether or not the PCs succeed, their fellow thieves are depending on this payday and will likely take further steps to gain the MacGuffin than guards would ever consider. Further yet, this adds the option of the PCs making the mission incredibly easy by teaming up with the other thieves. However, That action in turn forces a new difficult choice. Will the loot be split? If not, what happens to the other team? All right, now we're on to exfiltration missions. These ones are a little less straightforward to run, but nonetheless can easily be broken down into a few moving parts. The elements of an exfiltration gig are fairly straightforward. A person of interest needs to be extracted from a high security area and taken to a safe location. The mechanics here are easy to tamper with and weave into most plots. If you want to get advanced, your secondary goals during infiltration are a great tool to round out a gig that needs more content to fill out the greater story of play. Exfiltration prep is one of my favorite types, simply due to the sheer range of options available. I like to start with the target, who they are, why they want out of their situation, and who is willing to pay to get them out. The next step is figuring out who they work for. Next, we're under our biggest step. Where are they being held? Oftentimes, exfiltration missions feature corporate employees due to the very nature of the type of gig. The last step, of course, is determining what kind of security the PCs will encounter, including patrols and stationary guards. Again, you don't have to draw up a big elaborate map. A list with bullet points and short form notes will accomplish this. Now let's talk about some of the ways to keep exfiltrations interesting and keep your players on their toes. Right away, I'd like to talk about my personal favorite tactic, double crosses. Whether it's a third party or even a fourth party, offering the players more money to double cross their employers at the cost of their own street cred is always an interesting proposition. However, an especially fun variant of this is to have the exfiltration target themselves propose the double cross, giving the PCs two corporations that they'll have to avoid to achieve success. Another great way to shake up exfiltrations is to hide a deeper secret that the PCs are bound to come across during the gig. This gives you a chance to inject a side plot and possibly seed any larger meta plots that you may have at work here. For example, perhaps they found signs indicating that the site they're exfiltrating from is constructing some sinister project that they aim to test on a portion of the Sprawl's population. Suddenly, your PCs have two reasons to investigate: to stop the massacre and to perhaps sell this item on the black market or even keep it for themselves. The next twist we're going to talk about is non-human targets. The standard in this regard is usually androids or robots, but there are plenty of other options ranging from animals to synthetic humanoid life. This can be a fun option due to the element of surprise. Finally, unwilling exfil targets can make a mission both exceptionally challenging and add a layer of moral dilemma. All right, team, time to talk about assassination missions. Mechanically, these are some of the simplest missions for you as the GM to write. So let's break this type of gig down and examine its parts. All we really need for an assassination gig is a character who needs another character to die. Bonus points if they're willing to pay handsomely for it. This is probably the easiest type of mission to weave into a greater narrative, due in part to its flexible nature and the story potential that power vacuums create. If you want to get advanced with it, a great method is to center the assassination around some sort of grand event, preferably a public one. Let's talk about what you're going to want to prep before you run an assassination mission. I always start with designing the target, who they are, and why there's reason for their death. Next, I like to figure out who is paying for the killing and what they stand to gain. Finally, the last steps are to figure out the target security and pertinent scheduling. It should be noted that if you opt to run an assassination during a public event, it could potentially amplify your prep time considerably, depending, of course, on the event in question and what your plans for it are. It's time to talk about ways to mix up assassination jobs and keep them from becoming go there, shoot that missions. So first I want to bring up a particularly fun option, one that I've gotten a fair amount of mileage out of. Having the employer burn the PCs to avoid association and leaving the PCs in a bad situation that they'll have to work their way out of. Not only can this be a great plot catalyst for campaigns, but it also creates an incredibly dangerous and dramatic situation for your players. As with misinformation, this is a twist that should be used sparingly, lest your players become too wary of taking assassination gigs. Next up is the tried and true twist of having the target be surprisingly confident and work to escape and lure your PCs into their own den. This can turn a basic assassination into a two-part mission involving a full-scale siege. Another great option here is to add in a dash of infiltration and force the players to gain entry into some sort of compound before attempting to kill their target. My personal favorite twist, however, is to have the PCs be hired to make it look like an accident. This one is particularly great because it forces the players to think outside the box and hopefully gets them rolling some of their lesser used skills. It should be mentioned that if you want to be careful with this particular brand of twist, as it may punish combat-centric characters if done regularly, though it does offer considerable room for faces, troubleshooters, and infiltrators to shine. Well, that's it for today's episode. I hope I gave you something of value. Have a great day, and thanks for tuning in.